Hello, everybody. Today I'm with Max Leyf. Thank you, Max, for coming and joining me today. We're going to discuss Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy. And because it's Michaelmas, or was Michaelmas in the week, but it's like that time of year of Michaelmas, we thought we'd discuss Rudolf Steiner's views on Michaelmas and St. Michael and the dragon, or Michael as he calls him. So, Max, we thought we'd do like a little dialogue, didn't we? Thank you for
Yeah,
joining us.
that's correct. And Debbie, I just want to express my own appreciation for you taking the initiative and setting this up, reaching out to me, and I hope that together we can. We've both thought about Rudolf Steiner a little bit before, but I hope that today we can, in some ways, not allow those thoughts that we've already had to interfere with the possibility that we have together of discovering something new, and so I hope we can just sort of maintain that in our minds together, and our common a common motive to lead each other forward, and again try to achieve understanding that we maybe don't have before. And so I think this is again, I appreciate you providing this opportunity, and I hope that we can make good use of it.
I second that completely. I've been reading Steiner on and off for many years, and I must admit, when I first found him in my teens, I found him quite difficult to understand. And it's only been in the last 4 or 5 years that suddenly it's beginning to make sense. As the more of it as I read, it's like I wouldn't say an epiphany, that might be too much, but suddenly I began to connect all his different, they're not different ideas, because as we were saying earlier, it's all interconnected. And last
I know
week
what you mean when you say epiphany. Excuse me to interrupt you, but I
That's
know
right.
I know the feeling, and it's sort of it's kind of an aha moment
Mm,
where it's more than it's one it's kind of insight where you see into something, you see a connection that before you might have seen the same facts with your eyes, but you suddenly see with your understanding. And I think, I mean, the exciting thing about Rudolf Steiner and just all of these kind of questions is that in some way you are never finished with your epiphany. it it's not like a destination that you arrive at. It's much more like a I guess the image I have is a flower that doesn't stop blooming, that keeps blooming from the inside, and you get to take part in it in some way. So
oh,
I
yeah, that's
think
a
I know
beautiful
exactly what
way
you
of
mean.
saying it. Yes. Because it is like a flower. You suddenly, well, I suppose a lot of people would use the lotus or something, but you do feel like, aha, and you're blooming out and beginning to grow and go bigger and taller, or maybe like a tree, you're growing, reaching for the sky.
And something is drawing you too. I like the image of a tree because it's like the sun is drawing you. But I also think with a flower, it's what it really reminds me of is one of those roses where you don't know when it ends. Like it keeps going. A lotus, it's very clear, when the stamen and the pistil comes out, but a rose sometimes they have a sort of like unfathomable, almost infinite depth. Like you never know how far the rose can go. And so that's how I feel about these questions about philosophy. And you just imagine somebody like Steiner, or anyone that you and I find worth this sort of celebration of that person. You just imagine, like, wherever we are in terms of our epiphanies, this person has just had a number of more epiphanies than we do, and so in some ways just sees the world in that much more depth and coherence. So relation amongst parts, then also dimension into those parts, and who knows, maybe you and I can take some strides today, and I hope that will be a
Oh,
successful
yes, I
meeting.
hope so. So I was saying about Michaelmas, because I've recently put on my YouTube channel the Michaelmas talk that that Rudolf Steiner gave about Michael and the Michael imagination, and this is the time that Michael's we can reach up for him. I just wondered, what are your thoughts on that for this time?
Yeah. No, it's, I mean, it's there's so many entry points into that question. And just like any myth, it's always, it basically means as much as we're able to uh, understand from it or mean from it. Um, and this has been on my mind, I guess. I mean, in one way, it's so, like, right now you have the Draconid meteor showers. That if, like, you go out at night, especially a couple days ago. I think it was up to 20 meteors per hour that you would see on average or something. And like, so Steiner is connecting something like this to the way that the myth relates, Mikhail's vanquishing of the dragon. And again, it's almost hard to know where to try to enter into talking about a myth like this, because it's we'll never exhaust it. We'll never say like, okay, now we've pinned down the answer and then we can move on. Now we can close the book. Um, but I guess one question that I would sort of like to put before us is, what do we imagine? So like, suppose you and I could spectate on, because the myth of Mika and the dragon, it draws a lot on actually. You had mentioned the book of Revelation, the lectures that Rudolf Steiner gave concerning the book of Revelation to the priests. You mentioned that you were studying that in one of your study groups recently, and in the book of Revelation, there's a amazing, iconic scene of Michael, vanquishing this dragon that is coming to devour a woman clothed with the sun and with the stars at her. And so I think that's probably the origin, or one of the original source material for this myth. But just like everything, it's refined and perfected over time, like any myth. I think is an interesting question always. It's like, what aspects of the myth endure? Like, what aspects are we still telling today? What aspects are Steiner telling? And what aspects, it's not that they were false, but it's just that they were deemed kind of, or almost by a process akin to natural selection, the way people imagine that organisms develop through time, evolve through time. The myths undergo a very similar process. It's like certain myths we bother to remember, and other ones, like they talked about them once and we just don't talk about them today. It's like, what is going on there? What are these myths? What are they showing us? What are they depicting for us? And I think that's a fascinating question. So if you and I could spectate on the scene of Michael and his hosts entering into combat with the dragon in heaven, what do we imagine we would be watching? Like, what would we be privy to? What sort of thing? And I wonder if you have any thoughts, and maybe this is something we can just sort of explore together. I have some thoughts, but I don't want to, again, put them before us unless we want to
Okay,
open up
yeah.
space for new thoughts, basically. Yeah.
Well, I suppose because we're quite influenced by the cinema today, I see it as some big cinematic epic. But to me, these people, St. Michael and all the others, they're huge, amazing creatures or people. Like, he's supposed to be an angel, so he's got wings, supposedly.
Archangel.
An archangel, yeah.
A sort of like regent of angels,
Mm.
commanding a host of angels.
And yeah, he's the commander of one of the hosts of angels. I get my dominions and my thrones and all that all quite mixed up, who runs what, but I know he's
That will
one of
be
the
for our next
archangels.
conversation.
And because I was never sure, is this happening on Earth? Is it happening in the astral plane? Is it happening in the heavens? And Steiner seems to be saying it's the astral plane, maybe.
One thing that he says it happens in the heavens, which can refer to, like the astral world or something like that. He says that Michael actually casts the dragon out of heaven onto the earth. And that's something that I think would be worth thinking about, in a little bit once we've explored this first question. But so the idea is like, no, the dragon was in heaven, but now it's like down here.
So what was the dragon? Was the dragon an
Right.
angel gone bad? Which is what I'd always been led to believe, like, from either the Lucifer or the Satan. I know they're two different beings. Satan's the adversary, Lucifer was the light bringer. I always assumed it was Lucifer that came down as the dragon, but I don't, I could be wrong on that. And from Steiner's writings, I kind of gather that it's Lucifer.
Yeah. And then, Steiner gives these two sort of almost like principalities of not exactly evil, but that they will try to draw humanity away from the proper course of development. And it's like rather, this again, I mentioned at the beginning of when we were just doing introductions, I think it wasn't being recorded, but I mentioned how so often in Steiner I feel as though I'm being confronted with some kind of something that was sort of at the wellspring or the origin of the philosophical impulse. And we think of figures like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And I find with Steiner so often I feel as though I'm rediscovering a sort of like renaissance or renewal of something that you could discover in Plato or Aristotle, but it seems to have been maybe marginalized or even lost by the wayside in the course of the development of philosophical thinking. And today philosopher, I mean, I don't know what kind of mental image comes to people's minds, but you might imagine somebody working at a university, like almost wearing a coat or a lab coat or something, or you could imagine like a wandering kind of prophet type person wandering in India. These are kind of exact, stereotypical images that I'm just drawing on. But I think, obviously the word philosopher means somebody who, well, like philo indicates a sort of love for or affinity for. Something can be hydrophilic, and that means it draws in water, Um, and then Sophia obviously is like wisdom or some kind of understanding, wisdom contrasted to technical knowledge. So like technical knowledge would be tools or a way to accomplish some kind of outcome, and the Sophia would be much more about a sort of like understanding of those outcomes and kind of giving us the insight or the vision to know which outcome is worth pursuing in the first place. And so you have those two words almost like Legos coming together, Sophia and philo. And it's an interesting question. It's kind of equivocal. It's like, does it mean love of wisdom or wisdom of love? And the more I've thought about it, the less clear to me that those are separate things. It's almost as though it's like if you said, is it light or is it warm? It's like, well, the candle is the candle, and those are two like features of the candle or facets of the candle. In a similar way, it's like, I don't know, whatever the word philosophy means, it's one thing, and from one side it's the love of wisdom, and the other side it's the wisdom of love. That's probably a little bit more of a tangent than we want to go on today from Steiner, but I guess the point I wanted to make is, in our introduction, I was just noting that that in Steiner I see something that Plato indicated, which is if you really understood one of the virtues, if you really grasp that virtue all the way to the hilt and like thorough comprehension of it, you would have, in principle, understood all of the other ones too. Because in some way, the world is one, and we have to choose a particular point of entry. But once we enter into that one world, everything, we would discover the way in which everything relates to everything else. Everything sort of hangs together or breathes together. And just what this idea of, you mentioned the dragon might be Lucifer, and I just indicated the sort of opposite, or I picture it like a balance almost. The other side of the balance is another, not exactly evil, but misleading principality, and that's Steiner gives the name of Ahriman to this principality. And Lucifer, the name relates to light, so you have like lux, and then fair is the same. It's a similar root to like it means light bearer. In Greek, the word would actually be phosphorus. And so phos is light in Greek, and phoros is to bear. So like metaphor is the same root. And so you have fair in Latin, and even we have a word like ferry, like the boat that carries you. That's the Latin word. Ferry is where it comes from. So you have the lux, the light bearer is Lucifer, and the opposite polarity, obviously, you're left with Ahriman. And this Steiner just he basically repurposes the name of a Zoroastrian or Persian deity called Ahriman, or Angra Mainyu in maybe it's a different dialect of Persian or something. But so then it's a question of like, well, which is the dragon supposed to represent? And that's a question we could ask about. But I also just want to emphasize the idea that for Steiner, it's not as though there's like good guys and bad guys exactly. It's a question of finding a way not to be misled by the light-bearing impulse or the impulse of darkness, but to find a way to, not reject either one of those, but find a way to, in some ways, like establish a relationship between them that's harmonious. And this, so I'm again encountering something that the ancient philosophers, put before us that has sort of maybe just been, I don't know, trivialized almost. And it's Aristotle's idea of the virtue not being the opposite of a vice, but rather the balance between two vices. And so, in Latin, it's called the aurum mediocritas, or the golden mean. So the idea is like, if you display the virtue of courage, it doesn't mean that you're simply the opposite of a coward, or like you have a character trait that's the opposite of cowardice, because it's just as problematic or deleterious to be, and maybe even more so. It's probably even worse to be brash than it is to be to be a coward, to be to be a coward. It's probably worse to be reckless. Yeah. But so the idea for Aristotle is like, if you want to display courage, you have to find some way of recognizing those two ways of going wrong, like falling by, and finding a way of, again, not rejecting both of them, but finding a way to join them in a harmonious kind of balance or synthesis. And so I think that's such a helpful way to what Steiner gives us are imaginative, and so like very powerful, because that sounds so abstract. It's like, okay, well, you have two vices and you have to balance them to find the virtue. When you think about like Michael vanquishing the dragon or something, it's totally different. It gives you a completely different experience. But it leaves me also to wonder how, again, what is being depicted before us with the scene like Michael vanquishing the dragon. And you mentioned about like we go to the cinema, so our minds are just kind of almost like force fed all these different images, and so it can be confusing for us. Like those images will get in the way of our any kind of original imaginative faculty or process that we might demonstrate. But I think we can try to reclaim that or re-enter it by asking, like, so somebody had to there designers and artists that created the images in the movies that we see, and then we can just push the question back and say, what are they trying to show us? What are they, what is the source of how do they know what a dragon looks like, right? How do they know what an archangel looks like? What are they appealing to? And here's an even better way to ask it. It's like, suppose you come up with a number of proposals for an archangel. Suppose you have like 12 different pictures of an archangel. How do you choose the right one? Like, what are you looking for? I think it's such an interesting.
One sort of resonates with the writer or the designer at that time.
Yes, and what does it resonate? Like, what does it mean to resonate with? Like, how do you have that sense for what's the correct one? I mean, that's such a mystery, but I think that mystery is kind of an entry point into a totally, really different way of thinking about things than we usually do.
Can I just say about the dragon for a moment? Because I was just, while you was talking, I was thinking, yeah, what is the dragon? And I was thinking, if the dragon's been thrown from heaven and it was originally an angel, it's lost its light. So maybe that's why it's kind of, I'm not saying it's reptilian, but that's why it's become like a dragon. Because why a dragon? Is it because it's, quite a dull skin because the light's gone from it? It's just a beast, isn't it? So, and I suppose that's the best known, biggest beast that was known of in the myths was a dragon. Because sometimes you think of the fire-breathing dragon. Did it still have its angel wings? And that's why dragons have wings, because it's broken angelic wings. I don't know.
Well, here's something to think about. It's like, because you mentioned, we could think, okay, is the dragon supposed to represent Lucifer or Ahriman or something totally different? And I sometimes I wonder. It's like, is that the right way to think about the question, or is maybe what the dragon represents, how would I say this? Like, so, every person wears many hats. So it's like you among many other things. Right now, you're like a host of a meeting between two people from opposite ends of the earth. More or less. But it's like that's a role that you're playing. And there's other ones.
Of course, yeah. When I go to work, I put my work hat on. When I'm at home with the dog, I've got my going out with the dog hat on. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. What if we think of the dragon like that? So what if we think of the dragon not as like an object that you would run into, but rather I don't know if the right way to say this is a role, but it's like, think of the dragon as something that embodies and again, so we think of something like the adversary or the evil powers. That doesn't come, like, we don't, if we try to picture that in our minds, it doesn't really have a picture. It's kind of abstract. It's like the enemy. But then and this is, I think, something behind the process of all myths, and I think it's similar, like any artist has to do this. You have to find a way of giving form or giving imaginal body to concepts or notions. So we have a concept of like the enemy or the evil, whatever is going to draw us away from the the proper proper order of the proper path for development. And some people might have question the idea of like, well, what, maybe there's not a proper path, maybe it's just like everything goes and everything just kind of that's just your opinion, man, to quote the Big Lebowski. But I think but there's obviously a proper path, and you can just think about like childhood development. There's a thousand different ways, this is kind of maybe it's a cliche metaphor, but it's like there's a thousand different ways to get to the top of the mountain. But no matter what, you're always going in you are being drawn towards a definitive direction, which is upwards towards the and so I think similarly, it's we can imagine humankind in a sort of establish an analogy between ontogeny and phylogeny, and imagine the same way that when we were young to now, when you're infant, and then to the point where you're grown up or an adult, there's a sequence of a series of steps that you pass through. There's a path that you take, and in the same way, this is, I think, really essential element of Steiner's conception of what kind of place the world is, what kind of place. It's the idea that there is some sort of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and humanity is going through a process that's very akin to the process that each of us undergoes in our own biographies. So humanity itself has a biography.
Is at the moment with the dragon, we've seen it as the dragon needs to be defeated. Michael's here to slay the dragon, and I often wondered, why does he have to slay it? Why can't he like capture it and talk to it and teach it to become come back to the good side or something? I always found it weird that he has to be slain, but I suppose it's like the darkness inside ourselves. We do have to slay it. I used to think we can just work with it, but it's got a cheeky mind and can answer back very cleverly, so that's why it has to be slain.
Yeah, well, here's an interesting way to look at it, Devi, and you can tell me what you think. But I mean, it goes back to the idea, it's like, why do we remember some myths and other ones they more or less just fall by the wayside? You think like the number of myths that we forget is far exceeds the number that we will remember. For some reason, you and I are talking about the myth of Michael and the dragon today. Why aren't we talking about the myth of Saint George and the dragon? Like, they're very similar. Saint George, encounters a dragon, and there's a difference though, and besides the difference of, there's a difference of scale. Like Saint George is supposed to be a saint, not an archangel. But I don't know how relevant that difference is really, because the reason is because whatever is the scale, the principles that are at stake and that are being depicted in a myth, the principles can be the same irrespective of the scale. Like I don't know, you can imagine it like two amoebas fighting or something like that. Maybe that takes it too far, but if you see what I mean, the principles at stake will be the same.
Well, I think that's because the difference is maybe the myth was still remembered but not properly, or maybe some group of human beings somewhere decided to make it a man that slayed the dragon rather than relying on a celestial being, perhaps to boost the human, that the human can do this. A human man called George did it.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's something worth thinking about. And then just to throw something else into the mix. And so in one case, you're recognizing your place in a cosmic hierarchy. In other words, there are angelic and archangelic beings. In the other place, you're imagining you sort of, I don't know, it could lead to a sort of Luciferian conceit where you imagine that, again, it's a kind of, you get the idea of the light bringer. It's like you start to feel inflated with a sense of superiority or something. Another difference that I would point out about the myths that I think also could be a relevant difference that accounts for why we're talking about Michael and the dragon and not Saint George and the dragon. It's that Saint George, he does slay the dragon. Michael doesn't slay the dragon; he just casts it down to earth. And so we don't actually imagine a case in, when we're thinking about the myth of Michael and the dragon, we're not imagining the dragon is killed. Actually, we're imagining the dragon is cast out of heaven and cast down onto earth. And that's that gives a very different cast to the whole situation. And it might be, it's like mean, just can almost relate to what you said and say, well, before Michael's deed, the dragon was the the god's problem. Since Michael's deed, the dragon is our problem.
Yes, I'd never thought of it like that. That's true. It is now our problem because he's on our earth. So maybe that is why George was used in many myths instead of Michael or Michael. Because I
Yeah, and so
didn't
in some
remember.
ways they're not exclusive.
I
Go ahead.
kind of misunderstood. I thought Michael did slay him, but yeah, you're right. He casts him down to earth. But then why is Steiner saying that we need to help Michael slay the dragon? I thought it was. Maybe it isn't. I thought that was our task during this autumn time, was to take in the Michael energy and send it back to him so that he can continue his battle.
Debbie, my picture is always almost the inverse of that. It's that our job is to receive, almost like invite Michael to support our own work. And Steiner says Michael is like he'll never, one difference is between like Lucifer and Ahriman that Steiner describes. And again, I think we should always not imagine these are exactly things that are happening up in outer space somewhere, but rather try to say, what are, these are imaginal pictures. What are they depicting? And these are things that they're maybe too close for us to see until we're able to confront them in the form of these images.
Well, they're very clever, aren't they? They hide and deceive us with their wily ways.
That's a difference, is that Michael will never do that. Those beings, they will actually try to take initiative from us. Like they will try to manipulate us. And Steiner says the difference with Michael is that he'll just keep his distance until we ask for the assistance. And to me, and I'll be curious to just hear how you would make sense of that. But I mean, to me, it means like, what does it mean to ask? And it means something like, I guess, making space in my own mind and my own soul for something that's beyond my, if I really want to think about something and understand something, I realize that this almost sounds like nonsense, but I can't do it. And the reason I say it like that is because if it were something I could just do, probably would have already done it, but also I would somehow have an idea of like what thought to think next, right? But here's the fact, is that I have no clue what I'm going to think next. It's like I have to sort of get out of the way and allow that. And Steiner, he connects the idea of like objective thinking, so like cosmic thinking. Michael is the being of cosmic thought. And so again, if we try to put all these notions together, that cosmic thought won't influence us, or it won't take any part in our own lives except by invitation. And because this connects with Steiner's idea of freedom, and the backwards beings, Lucifer and Ahriman, they will always do what they can to kind of just subvert our freedom in some way, detract from it.
Distract us.
Yeah, the forward beings, they will do the opposite. They will always respect our freedom and do what they can. And again, this is so analogous to a child development. It's like if you have parents, your job is to create the conditions in which the child can develop. And so the gods are our parents, so to speak. The good gods, they don't seek to make us dependent on them or to draw us away from the proper order of development. They're actually trying to create conditions in which we can stand on our own 2 feet, so to speak. And so I just have this image of Michael as, the being of cosmic thought. And in some way, I'm only going to encounter that being if I sort of create a space in myself, to invite that process to work in me. The opposite of doing that is to have all kinds of, fixed ideas, then that's the opposite of inviting cosmic thought to work in you, I guess.
Well, fixed ideas is kind of linked to our own ego in a way of that we know what it is, what it's all about. And myself, I think that's Lucifer playing with our minds to try and deceive, like we were saying before, deceive us and to take us away from our missions. So I totally understand what you're saying, and I think it's right, but it is difficult in some ways because it's not something you can quite put in words, can you? It's kind of like more of an experience.
We can't, and that's I think what you said, I think you went right to the heart of this, because I think that's why we have the myths instead. It's because you can't put it in words. So what are you left with? Well, you're left with these pictures, and the pictures, they don't how would I say it? They don't speak in words. That's our job. It's to be able to look at the picture and be able almost to like transliterate it, or you know, receive the inspiration of what the image is supposed to convey. It's almost like so imagine whoever thought of the myth first was doing one process. It was kind of condensing principles into images. And when we want to understand those images, we have to just do the same thing, but the reciprocal process of that, which is to be able to perceive or recognize within those images the principles that are at stake. And so they're not exclusive at all. In fact, they're the same thing, but in almost like a different language or something.
Yeah, it is like a different language. It's a language that we're trying to connect to, but it's not a spoken word, is it? But it's all part of the feeling, the thinking, and also our physical bodies. I suppose I'm going a bit Gurdjieff here. Of all the three centers, you've got to align yourself, which I believe Steiner was saying, which is why he was trying to teach us through the books of, because we don't get to meet him ourselves. I'm sure if we were in his presence, we could see how he had himself all centered to be able to accept everything and receive everything. And that's what we've got to try and do ourselves, isn't it? And prepare ourselves for all this kind of work.
No, it's a great point. And again, I mean, we have the benefit of people like Steiner who tried to communicate these, these, just to take the myth of Mickey on the Dragon. It's like that can mean something for us, but in some way, it's also our responsibility to take initiative and try to perceive or understand the meaning that it does contain.
One of the meanings that I've been finding interesting was about the sword. Have you been reading about the sword and about how he's saying the sword was made from the meteors that we were discussing earlier, the meteors going through the sky, and that with these meteors going through now during Michaelmas, we must draw down that iron energy and put it into ourselves. And we do that by, during the summer, we should have been out in the sun and getting all the sun's energy, and that would attract that iron from the meteors as they're flying by. And I found that quite mind-blowing in some ways, of trying to visualize it. But at the same time, it's like, why do we need that iron? Is it to make the sword in us to wield ourselves?
It's amazing with Steiner again, because everything you say, it branches out, and this is a spatial metaphor for something that's not spatial. In the same way, it's not clear that the image of, or wherever Mickey on the Dragon, wherever that battle is happening, it's not clear that it's somewhere in outer space, in physical, in three-dimensional space. But just what you described, it's the question of iron and the meteors with Steiner, and with with this way of conceiving the world. Everything is, just every single idea, concept like iron, it just branches out in like infinite filaments and connects with everything else. But you can't think of, one of the most immediate connections, you can't think of iron except without thinking of Mars. And the planet of Mars, but also the planet as a a physical symbol for the archetype of the martial archetype. And this is one of the 7 original correspondences, the metallic correspondences. So every planet has a metallic correspondence, and obviously between Mars and iron, the other ones like Saturn and lead, Jupiter and tin, Venus and copper, the sun and gold, moon and silver, Mercury and quicksilver. But like so Mars has this part of the archetype of Mars is obviously the Aries, the warrior archetype. But it's also it has something to do with, you were making a gesture about kind of aligning yourself or something, and that's that's really fundamental principle of the Martian, the martial archetype. And it's a kind of there's a sort of nobility about the martial archetype, in terms, it's like a kind of individuation that's willing to stand up for something. And that to me, it's very intimately related to the idea of Michaelmas. It's kind of like it's again it's consistent with the idea of the dragon now being our responsibility, and so it's like how am I going to stand up to the dragon, vertically, and again the dragon, we can think of it really as, suppose you have to express the principle of all of those powers and features of the world and of life that conspire to draw me away from what is from what I know to be right. And you have to give that so that's a kind of, it's an abstract principle, but so it's like, okay, what does that look like if you have to again try to communicate this through images, which in some way the images, they're like a you have the like the pre-Babel time, and then you have the Tower of Babel, and then we get 1,000 different languages, nobody can communicate. But then you have something almost, you have an image of the Pentecost, which is like suddenly people are speaking in tongues, which are transcendent. It's a way to communicate above language or beyond language. And in some way, these images, that's what they do for us. We can imagine them as like the Pentecostal speech or something. It's speech that transcends national and ethnic boundaries of language. But then we have to, so we can express, so the principle that I said of everything that is adversarial to proper development. If I said that in Spanish, it would be todo que, whatever, or German, alistas, etc. Every language would have a different way of saying it. But the image is the same. And so again, this is you could think of it as sort of, pre-Babel or post-Babel, really a Pentecostal way of speaking, which goes beyond all the limitations that we have in terms of speaking between languages. So, what would that look like if you had to give the principle or that word, that the principle adversary, a shape? To me, it seems very intuitive. It's like you would amalgamate all of these, would have horns and teeth and fire and scales and wings and tail, everything. You put it all together. Yeah, that's the dragon. That's one way of thinking about it.
I find
And so
it
rather than being
interesting.
a thing,
Oh,
it's a
sorry.
principle. Well, rather than being a thing, it's much more a principle. It's like a hat, similar to the way that right now I'm wearing a hat as a dialogue partner, for example. What does a dialogue partner look like? It doesn't really have a look. You have to find a way to give it a look, right? Or you said like sometimes I'm walking a dog. What does a dog walker look like? I don't know. I'm a brother. I'm all kinds of things. Friend, Rolfer, different things, different hats that I wear. But somehow you have to, those in themselves don't have a look, but you give them a concrete look. Similarly, adversary or quote, whatever draws us away from the proper path of development, unquote, that doesn't look like anything until we're able to give it a picture. And to me, the most appropriate one is a dragon.
And the most appropriate one to slay the dragon would be an angel of some kind, or a saint, if you're in for the St. George, if you prefer St. George's. I was always told the way to tell the difference between George and the dragon and Michael and the dragon is Michael always has wings and George is usually just on a horse, which I always found quite interesting. That you had to ride a horse in to take out the dragon. I don't think Michael's ever on a horse.
Yeah, and the myth of St. George has to do with a dragon that's threatening a castle, and there's a princess, and so St. George is actually defending the princess as he slays
So he's
the
defending
dragon
the feminine.
and wins
Maybe
the girl.
it's the masculine and the feminine.
Well, you have so with Michael, it's different. He's defending whatever is the woman crowned with the stars in the Book of Revelation. But it's often been associated with Sophia, who is a presence, kind of like a mysterious presence throughout the Old and New Testaments. Sophia would be like wisdom.
So she's like the mother goddess as well, isn't she?
Yeah, and so in a somewhat analogous way, the way that George is kind of like the sublunary instantiation of the Michael archetype for us, the Virgin Mary is kind of the same thing for the principle of Sophia in the stars. And so the idea, how would I say this? It's like, so Mary gives birth to Christ. Wisdom gives birth to love, maybe. And the reason I say it that way is because because like the idea of wisdom, it's sort of like seeing the internal way in which everything is joined intimately with everything else. And the only, to really see that, you can't help but just, you just, I don't know, it's, and I don't know anything about it. I'm just, speaking about what the saints describe, but, you just feel a sort of intimate relation with everything that you encounter. There's nothing as though it's like, you don't encounter enemies anymore. You encounter everywhere.
Well, with a loving presence, but it's not love, sexual love, or it's compassion, isn't it? It's a compassionate love.
Yeah, it's interesting, but I agree with you. It's not sexual love, but it's certainly not antithetical to it. Like it might be that sexual love is like one in the same. So you have you have like Michael fighting the dragon, and Saint George is one instance of that. Or it takes one element of Michael's fight with the dragon and instantiates it or embodies it. And it might be that sexual love is like one facet or one feature of something that is much much greater, perhaps. Sexual love might be whatever this, and this draws back again, this is an example of kind of harkening back to Plato, but it might be that sexual love is kind of like the corporeal image of transcendent love. Like, so there's a principle of love, and if you want to know what that principle looks like, corporeally, then the answer would be sexual love. But sexual love doesn't exhaust that principle.
Yes, I agree on that. Absolutely, yeah. I was going to say about with Sophia being the wisdom and Michael's protecting her, is that just, if we lose the wisdom, then we lose our way to the divine. So that's why the dragon's after her.
Right. I think that's a good way to look at it. It's like wisdom is the doorway through which something enters into the world, and so we have to protect that gateway, or that sacred portal. One thing I would just say about sexual love is obvious. Whatever we think of with sexual love, there's something to do with trying to overcome separation. You just think of whenever there's, because sex itself comes from the words, it's the same root as section or sectarian, so it has to do with a division. And it's obvious that whatever sex means to us, it means some way of trying to reconcile that division. And this again goes back to Plato, but there's a really and this is a Symposium. There's a really funny, I think it's Aristophanes in the Symposium. He gives a sort of myth, but it's one that's worth remembering in my opinion. He says, like, there was originally a sort of, and this is the Greek tradition, obviously, but we have something similar in the Hebrew tradition, which is like Adam Kadmon, the original Adam before there was Eve, as a polarity to him. So this is like Adam, he, but not in contrast to she. It's like, it doesn't even you don't really say he exactly, except to contrast it with she. So Adam is, when Eve comes out of his rib, this is a symbol for, again, establishing a polarity between something that before there was no polarity. And this is the beginning of, you wouldn't think about sex except for a polarity like that. I'm trying to close the polarity. Aristophanes, in a totally different tradition, in the Greek tradition, but he gives the myth of, again, he says human beings were originally spheres, and but Zeus, as in usual fashion, like Zeus became envious of the human beings because they were so complete within themselves as spheres, and so he, with a thunderbolt, he cleft them in twain, and then so we're always looking for our completing, our better halves, our completing halves. And then again, I just think the image of sort of coming together, what the sexual impulse that draws people together. We're trying to achieve a kind of completion, but you realize it's not that it's impossible, but sex, in terms of just if we just think of sex as a physical act, it's never going to accomplish what is really at stake, because you can never, I don't know, like the principle of the physical corporeal world is that everything is outside of everything else, and that's what we mean when we say space. It's if you want to know what space is, it's like the way of differentiating physical bodies. And so you realize, no matter what, you're not going to overcome whatever that impulse is that we call sex in the physical plane, and love maybe. We don't have the best word. We don't have a great word for it, but we could call it love if we think of a cosmic principle. The physical plane is not the it's not the place to do it. I mean, not that's not the place to do it, but it's never, you're never going to entirely overcome those differences, because that's the principle or the nature of the physical plane, is to have those differences. But I mean, there are, you realize like what love is. It's some way without abolishing differences, but you also almost you do achieve some kind of union with whatever you love. You no longer think of it as like something separate from you entirely.
But it's also like we're all looking for that, as you were saying, we're searching. We're all searching to find our way back to God, but people don't think of it that way. They just think we're looking for most people think they're looking for their soulmate or something like that. Because that sexual act, when you have that orgasm, that's the moment when you are probably closest to God, and you are being like a God, because you're creating something if you should have a child out of it. So it's quite a sacred moment anyway, which is why I think magicians are so in awe of it and are always using it for their magic. It's in so many different magical traditions about, you know, the sacred orgasm, the sacred semen, the sacred what women have. So there's something about that which maybe people just don't understand.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. It's like, what would you be able to describe in terms of sex if you described it like through, not exactly through physics, but if you described it without taking into account the like the psychological or the inner dimension to it, the soul dimension to it, you would describe something, and again, it would be, I mean, you would be describing two physical bodies that are drawn towards each other and trying to overcome that difference. Once you start to describe, I mean, once you, but you know, there's an inner dimension, and by inner I just mean in contrast to the outer spatial dimension, that seems to come much closer to. I mean, that seems itself to be the impulse that impels the attempt to close the physical proximity, is whatever we're looking for in terms of our soul, like, you know, inwardly, soul rather as in contrast to body, experience in contrast to whatever you could describe, you know, through physics or whatever. And, you know, just to draw on Plato again, he describes a sort of almost like an ascent from particulars to universals in respect to love. This is in the Symposium, but he says, like, you will begin to recognize that all of these diverse and differentiated instances of love, they are participating in something common. Like, there's a common principle of love that they all draw on, and in fact, it's that principle that we have some intuitive connection to, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to recognize these differences of these instances of love in the first place, right? We have some familiarity with it. And then but so Plato's idea of the philosopher is the one who does try to make that ascent to discover, you know, to approach the principle of love from which all the individual instances are deriving.
So do you think we should be, sorry, go on.
Well, I just add one further final thought, which is that this is again where it becomes equivocal whether philosophy means the love of wisdom or the wisdom of love. And just by the name itself, it's not clear. And it's also not clear if you try to answer the question through reading Plato's dialogues, because the Symposium is a perfect example where the whole thing is, it's a question of achieving the wisdom of love and not so much the love of wisdom. But
I'd like to think it's both. And
yeah, I agree.
Thinking about it in both ways would lead to some total understanding or more complete understanding if you're looking at it from both ways of seeing it. Because it is interesting, is it the wisdom of love or the love of wisdom? Most people are looking for wisdom to put themselves forward in their lives in whatever they're doing. So that would be, well, probably love of wisdom. But the wisdom of love, if you understood what love was properly, then you would have a better understanding of how to be yourself and be with others, because you'd be, like we were discussing earlier, a more loving type of person.
and I think that you really went right to the heart of it again with what you said. You would be yourself and with others, and I think that's, that's such an essential feature of love, where it's not. And again, we can imagine in a similar way to Aristotle the idea of finding the virtue between the two vices or the two extremes, or the idea of Steiner, who puts Michael or Christ between Lucifer and Ahriman. One thing that love is not is total abolishment of differences and just kind of merging into a cosmic soup. Because love always, it implies some kind of bridging of a separation. And if you abolish the difference in the first place, there's no separation to bridge. On the other side, it's obviously, and that would be the Luciferian temptation with love, would be to try to, like, merge like a drop into the cosmic ocean or something, dissolve yourself. The Ahrimanic temptation would be basically refusing, refusing to try to bridge the separation at all, and it would be kind of infinite atomization. So everything would be separate from everything else, and that's one way of looking at, again, one way of thinking about why. There's so many ways to take this, but if you think of like, where is heaven? You might be the way you're asking the question might be setting you up not to see the answer. It might be that heaven is not spatially situated, and this is kind of again, I think this probably goes back to Plato, but it's like wherever the forms are, the Platonic forms, you couldn't get them in a rocket ship. You couldn't get to them, with a space shuttle. Somehow they're like the interior dimension of what we perceive outwardly through our senses. If the dragon is cast out from heaven onto the earth, one way of thinking of that might be that the dragon is basically, this would be construing the dragon as Ahriman, but the dragon would be cast into physical space, and that's what keeps everything in the outer world separate from everything else. Yeah. And so this would be on the one side, Lucifer will preempt the realization of love by totally abolishing differences. So everything just merges into a cosmic soup. Ahriman will prevent it by turning everything into infinitely differentiated, and that characterizes the physical world that we live in. It's like when you think of an object, to think of an object in the first place, that means you're differentiating it from every other object. You realize, though, that that's not the only world we live in. We live in two worlds, so to speak. Another world is the world of our understanding, or our minds, or our souls. And you realize that things are not differentiated. They're not separated in that way at all. Just the example of being able to wear many hats. It's clear that these things, they coexist, and they are coextensive too. So that's the idea. Like in physical space, things can't be coextensive. That's what physical space means. They're not. In ideational or psychic or spiritual space, everything is in principle. Again, there's no space. Things are not separated. Everything relates to everything else. And that's kind of what we're encountering with Steiner too, where if we really think through one of these ideas, we realize that everything else is contained in it. And so the idea, but we're able to retain the differences. So we're not abolishing the differences. So it's neither Luciferic nor Ahrimanic. We are somehow walking the middle, what is it called? The middle way between these two sides. And again, I think that's in some way that's an essential element of love. It's the ability to join two things without destroying either one of them.
It's beautifully put, because one of my favorite authors is Maurice Nicole, and I know you read Maurice Nicole, and he talks about the pendulum, because he was the one that made it clear to me that it's not either side. We want that pendulum to stay still and be in the middle, which is just what you're saying, really. And then that way you can see both sides.
Mm-hmm.
We are the pendulum.
Yeah, amazing.
We mustn't swing.
Yeah, swinging. No, I just reflecting on how how fortunate, how blessed we are to have people like Maurice Nicole and Steiner and 1,000 other people that have gone before us. And if we see something, it's because we're standing on the shoulders of giants.
Well, I've always said we're coming into the age of Aquarius. The age of Pisces is coming to an end. The age of Pisces was all the teachers, like the people you're talking about, and all those that were before them. And now we've got all their work to work on us so that we can go forward and do it, be it, and make it happen.
And that's a great image. That's a great image that you gave. And again, it's like at one time, the gods took care of our responsibilities for us, just like our parents used to when we were young. But when I was young, I spake as a child, I thought as a child, I understood as a child. But now that I'm become a man, I put away childish things. At some point, it's like the responsibility befalls us, and then it's a question of whether we're able to, stand up and meet it and take the cross on our backs. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask you one more thing. So, do you think with the dragon, we're supposed to be sending it love? That's what we should be doing, trying to send it the love.
Yeah, it's such a hard question, Debbie, because I could imagine giving either answer. I could say yes, and I could say no, and I could imagine explaining why I gave each answer, and giving a cogent reason for giving each answer. And so I think instead, what I'll do is just hedge and say, is the dragon really something, an object that we could refer either our love or our hatred to? Is that the right way to conceptualize the dragon? Or do we imagine the dragon, so by analogy, you could have cold water or you could have hot water. And if you warmed up the cold water, it would be hot. So the idea is like, there are two principles. One of them is heat and one of them is cold. And the water could be either one. The water as a physical object, it could be either one of them. And the water itself. So the water is not exclusive to being hot or cold, but hot and cold are exclusive to one another. Because if something ceases to be hot, then you will just call it cold, and vice versa. And so those are identifying principles. And I think the dragon is much more like that. That if the dragon became an object of our love, it would not be a dragon anymore.
Beautifully put.
So
I like that. Yes.
The dragon is what we are tasked to, in some ways, vanquish or overcome. And once we overcome it, it's not a dragon anymore.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to say thank you very much, Max. This has been brilliant. Do you want to say about your YouTube channel?
I don't know how much to say. That I have a YouTube channel, and anyone and everyone is welcome.
What is the name of your YouTube channel?
It's Max Leyf, PhD, and maybe Debbie, you would be kind enough just to put a link to it in the bottom, maybe with the notes, and I'll give you the information we finish. But I doubt that I said this, and I just want to express again how much I appreciate you. You really took all the initiative here and contacted me, and I really appreciate that. So thank you very much, and I hope we can do this again.
Yeah, I would love to. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, Max. Thank you very much, and until next time.
Hey, likewise, Debbie. Best wishes.